first, let's focus on our new interval, the perfect fifth. Now, we looked at our first interval in the previous unit, and that was the octave, right? That was 8 white notes up, 8 in-key notes up, as we'll soon learn. The perfect fifth is 5 notes up. Now, don't let that word perfect throw you. That's kind of just a terminology thing. That'll make more sense later when we talk about major and minor chords. But for now, let's just think of it as the fifth, okay? So to find it, let's start on a C. So here's a C. And now I'm going to count 5 white notes up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a G. So the interval of a perfect fifth starting on C gets us to a G. So in other words, G is a fifth higher than C. So why do we care about the perfect fifth? When it comes to what I used, the lingo I used in the previous lesson was, kind of like safe and dangerous things you can do. The octave is super safe. If you're just working with octaves, it's going to be pretty tricky to make something sound bad. The fifth is the second most safe interval. You can make the fifth, if you just throw fifths on everything, it's not guaranteed that it's going to sound great. It's going to have a particular sound, but the fifth itself is pretty safe to use. So if you want to add a note to a melody that's going to kind of beef it up and make it sound a little thicker, the fifth is a good note to use. So count up 5 notes of the key, and you'll get there. Now, there's a reason that we like the perfect fifth. Remember, we talked last time about, when we were talking about octaves, we talked about the 1-to-2 ratio, looking at the waveforms. The fifth has a 2-to-3 ratio. So for every 2 of our root note, we're going to call this a root note, we have 3 of the fifth above it waveforms. So all that really means, if you're not following this stuff about waveforms, all that really means is that the waveforms fit together relatively nicely, and when that happens, we generate a sound that we tend to like. That tends to be a consonant sound, we would say, as opposed to a dissonant sound. But let's take this analogy of, or not analogy, this idea of the waveforms one step further to really understand it, because I want to look at how the fifth works when we're dialing in a synthesizer, right? This is something that in a traditional music theory class you would never ever do. Talk about the specific frequencies of pitches. But when it comes to synthesis, we need to know this stuff. So, the perfect fifth is a 2-to-3 ratio. What that means is that, for example, if we played if this note, our lower note, let's call that the fundamental or the root, both those words can apply. The fundamental tends to mean is more of a synthesis term. Root is more of a music theory term, but essentially meaning the same thing in this context. If that is 1,000 hertz, then the fifth is going to be 1,000 times 2/3 or 1.5. So it's going to be 1,500 hertz. That's going to get us to a fifth above the root. So let's look at how that works in a synthesizer. Okay, so I've loaded up an operator here. This is just a synthesizer in Ableton Live. And I've made a MIDI clip that's just going to play a note over and over and over. Right? Kind of sounds like your alarm going off. Okay, so here's what I've done here is I've set this first oscillator. I've turned all the other oscillators off. So I just have one oscillator here. And I've set it to fixed mode, which means it's ignoring this pitch, and it's just kind of using that rhythm. And I've set it to 1 kilohertz, 1,000 hertz, okay? So I'm going to add a fifth on top of that. I'm going to add another oscillator. I'm and turn it up. And I'm going to set this one to 1500 or 1.5 kilohertz. There we go. So here's the note without the fifth. And let's add the fifth in. So that is the sound of a fifth. And another reason we care about fifths is that we need them to make chords. So fifths become very important once we start assembling chords, which we really only need one more interval to start putting together chords.